The crystal towers of Velshara reached up into the purple sky like frozen lightning, and their surfaces glowed with soft light that had once made the elf homeworld shine like stars brought down to the ground, but now in the medical room carved from Livingstone, that light was growing dim around a small form lying still on a bed of silver Mastley Rain Stormweaver. Was the pack leader of the Skyborn Guard, and she was bonded to the great red dragon named Embereth, and she pressed her pale fingers against the crystal wall, and her silver eyes that were usually as sharp as winter stars were now clouded with a sadness that made her 300 years of life feel like a curse, because she had never felt so helpless before. "Cub fades," my sister rumbled. Emberuth, from where he was coiled in the big opening of the chamber, and his scales caught the dying light like blood on water, and the dragon mind touched hers. Through their bond, and she felt his pain match her own. And the healers say there is nothing more they can do. The cub was not hers by blood, but by oath and young. Silverscale was barely 2 seasons old, and he had lost his mother when she fell in the war against the Void Collective, and that battle had torn through 3 star systems and left the elf fleet scattered like leaves before a storm in Lyrain had found the baby dragon in the wreckage of a crashed ship, crying over his mother cooling body, and she had sworn the ancient words of pack bond without any hesitation at all. Now that bond was killing her from the inside, as she felt Silverscale life force getting weaker and weaker like a candle in a storm. The elf healers had tried everything, and their medical technology was refined over thousands of years, and they had looked at every molecule and every cell and every tiny piece of the young dragon-failing body, and they had looked in the ancient records and called upon the wisdom of the oldest of their kind and used techniques that could fix broken bones in hours and cure diseases that would destroy other species. None of it had worked at all. It is the grief sickness the chief healer, who was an ancient elf named Valeth, had said with the cold finality of someone giving bad news, and the trauma has broken something in his spirit that our science cannot touch, and he withdraws from life itself, and in 3 days, or maybe, for his hearts will stop beating. Glarain had sent Valeth away and stood watch beside the dying cub with one hand resting on his cooling scales and feeling the weak flutter of his 2 heartbeats growing fainter with each passing hour, and Emberoth's presence was a constant warmth at her back. But even the great dragon legendary strength could not bring life to one who had given up the will to live. That was when the human ship came. The ship was ugly by elf standards, and it was a blunt nose ship called the Mercy Call that looked like it had been put together from spare parts and good intentions, and it had the markings of the Terran Medical Corps, which was one of humanity. Famous relief organizations that seemed to show up wherever suffering existed, no matter what the borders or treaties or common sense. Badly Rain had heard of humans, and everyone in the galactic community had heard of them too, and they were the newcomers and the upstarts who had exploded into the wider universe barely a century ago with their basic FTL drives and their strange disregard for sensible caution, and they fought like demons and negotiated like merchants and had a disturbing tendency to adopt anything with a face as either friend or pet. The elves had mostly dismissed them as barbaric curiosities who were too unstable and short-lived to be of any real consequence. But now, as Lyrain watched the human shuttle come down through Velshara atmosphere with all the grace of a falling rock, she felt something stir in her chest that she barely recognized anymore. Hope. The woman who came out of the shuttle was not what Lyrain expected at all, and she was small and barely reached Lyrain's shoulder, and she had warm brown skin and dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, and she wore the blue and white uniform of the Terran Medical Corps, and she carried a worn canvas bag that looked like it had survived several wars. Commander Lyrain Stormweaver, the human asked, and her accent was strange, but her command of the elf language was decent. And I am Lieutenant Amy Carter, and I am a xenobiological specialist, and I heard you have a sick dragon. Lyrain studied the human with the wariness of a hunter meeting an unknown species, and up close the woman seemed even more fragile than expected in humans. She knew lived barely a century, and their bones broke easily, and their skin tore, and they could not even see properly in low light. And yet Amy Carter stood before her with an expression of calm determination, as if treating dying dragons was something she did every week. Our healers have used up all their knowledge. Lorraine said carefully. And what makes you think a human can succeed where elf science has? Faldami's smile was gentle, but there was steel beneath it. And because sometimes the answer is not in the science, and may I see the patient against every instinct. Lorraine led the human into the medical chamber, and Emberoth raised his great head as they entered, and his eyes narrowed to slits as he looked at the newcomer, and Amy stopped and tilted her head back and met the dragon gaze without flinching at all. You must be Emberoth, she said softly, and I have heard stories, and they say you held the Void Fleet at the Shattered Gates for 3 days, while the civilian ships got away in Borth. Surprise rippled through the bond Lyrene shared with him, and humans knew of that battle, and he lowered his head slightly to show respect, and Amy smiled before turning her attention to Silver Scaleth. Young Dragon lay without moving, and his silver scales were dull, and his breathing was so shallow it was barely visible at all, and Amy set down her bag and knelt beside him and placed one small hand on his side, and for a long moment she was silent, and Lorraine felt Emberoth's doubt matching her own. Then Amy opened her bagoot she pulled out, made Lyrene breath catch, and it was not gleaming instruments of advanced technology, and not quantum scanners or gene sequencers, or any of the sophisticated tools the elf healers had used. Dried herbs and glass bottles of oil, and a worn wooden bowl and stick for grinding in things that belonged in a museum, not a medical facility. What is this? Lorraine demanded in primitive superstition. Me glanced up, and there was something in her eyes that silenced any further protest. And Lieutenant Commander, your healers tried to fix his body, but Silverscale is not dying from physical damage, and he is dying from a broken heart, and sometimes the old ways understand grief better than any scanner. She began grinding herbs with practiced skill, and the sharp scent of what Lorraine enhanced senses identified as chamomile and lavender filled the air. And on Earth, we have been dealing with psychological trauma for as long as we have existed, and long before we had the technology to map brain chemicals or measure brain waves. We learned that certain plants and certain rituals and certain presences could help the wounded spirit heal them. Dragon biochemistry. Lorraine began as surprisingly similar to several Earth species. Amy interrupted gently, and I have been studying the medical records your people shared with the Terran database, and dragons produce stress hormones when upset, and their emotional centers respond to sensory input in predictable ways, and young dragons, like young humans, need comfort more than they need medicine. Mixed the crushed herbs with warm oil and created a paste that she began rubbing gently into silver scales and working in slow, soothing circles, and the scent grew stronger, and Lorraine felt her own tension easing slightly. I'm also going to need your help, Amy said, and glancing at Emberoth and both of you. Over the next 2 days, Amy Carter turned the sterile medical chamber into something that looked more like a nest, and she brought in soft fabrics from the human ship and arranged them around Silver Scale bed, and she burned incense that filled the air with calming scents, and she brought in a small device that played gentle sounds and what she called music and flowing patterns of tones that seemed to ease something deep in Lyrene chest. But more than that, she taught them how to heal talk. To him, Amy told Lorraine on the first evening as they sat watch beside the unmoving baby dragon, and tell him stories, and tell him about his mother, and tell him about the world waiting for him. He cannot hear, Lorraine protested, and he is too far gone. He can hear, Amy insisted, and maybe not with his ears, but with something deeper. In coma patients on Earth show increased brain activity when loved ones speak to them, and the unconscious mind is listening even when nothing else responds. So Lorraine spoke, and haltingly at first, then with growing ease she told Silverscale about his mother's bravery, and about the pack that waited to welcome him, and about the great hunts he would fly when he was grown, and she told him about Emberoth legendary battles, and about the beauty of Vel-Shara, crystal forests, and about the taste of starfire, and the song of the void between worlds. Amy sat nearby, and occasionally applying her oils and checking the baby dragon vital signs with both her human instruments, and simple touches and fingers against pulse points in ear, against chest, and she showed Lyrene pressure points in places where gentle massage could ease pain and help blood flow, an ancient human medical knowledge that was thousands of years old and applied to an alien species with surprising results on Earth. Amy said quietly one night as they kept their watch. And we have a saying, and healing is both a science and an art, and your people perfected the science, but somewhere along the way I think you forgot the Artem Berwith, who was coiled nearby, rumbled thoughtfully. And what is this art you speak of, small human Amy? Smiled in presence and touch, and the knowledge that sometimes what heals is not a cure, but the feeling of not being alone. And my grandmother was a nurse in the old style, and before all the technology, and she used to say that half of medicine was just showing up and caring. She pulled out a small leather book from her jacket, and she gave me this before she died, and it is full of old remedies, and some of them are obsolete now, sure, and we have better drugs and better procedures, but some of them work. Not because of chemistry, but because of something else, and because healing is about more than fixing what is broken, and it is about giving someone a reason to want to be fixed. Lorraine took the book when Amy offered it, and turning the fragile pages carefully, and recipes for healing pastes and teas, and instructions for massage and meditation, and hand-drawn diagrams of pressure points and energy flows, and it seemed primitive and unscientific. It also seemed full of love. My people have lived for thousands of years, Lorraine said softly, and we have seen empires rise and fall, and we have perfected arts that your kind cannot imagine, and yet you, who live barely 100 years, understand something we have forgotten. Maybe that is why we understand it, Amy replied. And when you only have a century, you learn to value each moment and each connection, and you learn that presence matters more than perfection. In the third day, Amy introduced them to something she called physical therapy, and despite the medical chamber, advanced floating beds, and automated support systems, she insisted on manual exercises, and she showed Lorraine how to gently stretch silver scale wings, and how to massage his leg muscles to prevent them from getting weak, and how to touch his scales in patterns that she claimed would encourage brain activity. Body remembers, Amy explained as she guided Lorraine's hands through the motions, and even when the mind is shut down, the body remembers being alive, and we are reminding him remember with. Watch these exercises with intense interest, and your kind is strange. Amy Carter and you have ships that can cross the stars, yet you rely on these ancient practices. We do not rely on them, Amy corrected gently, and we combine them, and the best human medicine uses everything in advanced drugs alongside traditional herbs, and surgery alongside meditation, and we learned a long time ago that throwing away the old just because we discovered the new was foolish, and both have their place. She looked at Silver Scale, and her expression softened, and besides, there is something else. And when I do this, and when I use my grandmother remedies, I feel her with me, and like her knowledge, and her caring, and her presence flows through my hands, and maybe that is superstition, or maybe presence itself is a medicine we do not fully understand yet. That night, as Lorraine performed the massage routine Amy had taught her, she thought she felt Silver Scale body relax slightly under her hands, and it might have been imagination, and it might have been wishful thinking. It might have been the first sign of Hilanami. Also taught them about patience, and about the small victories that mattered. And look, she would say, and his breathing is a little deeper today, and see how his scales have more color in these things. Our progress. Lorraine had been trained as a warrior, and in battle you won or you lost, and there was no middle ground. But Amy showed her that healing was different, and that it was made up of tiny steps forward and sometimes steps backward, and that every small improvement was worth celebrating. The human also had a gift for making even the darkest moments feel less heavy, and she would tell stories about Earth, and about her grandmother, who had been a nurse in wars, and about medical missions, 2 distant planets, and about the time her crew had to perform surgery during a meteor storm year. People seem to find themselves in difficult situations often. Emberath observed one evening. Amy laughed, and that is putting it mildly, and humans have a talent for being in the wrong place at the right time, or maybe the right place at the wrong time, and we are still figuring that out. But beneath the humor, Lorraine could see the steel, and this small human who seemed so fragile had probably seen more death and suffering than many warriors, and yet she still showed up and still cared and still believed that healing was possible on the fourth morning something changed. Liraine woke from a light doze in the chair beside Silverscale bed, and for a moment she could not figure out what had changed, and then she realized the baby dragon breathing was stronger. She leaned forward and placed her hand on his scales, and they were warmer, and the dual heartbeat was steadier, and through the pack Banshee felt something she had not felt in Daizé. Flicker of consciousness. Sami Liraine called softly, and Amitha. Human medic was there in moments, and rubbing sleep from her eyes. And what is Heidi? I think he is coming back, Liraine, whispered Amy, moved to Silverscale's side and checked his vital signs with quick, efficient movements, and her human instruments beeped and hummed. And then she looked up, and her smile was like sunrise. He is stabilizing, she said, and his brain activity is increasing, and heart rate is stronger, and he is fighting his way back in Berwith. Great head appeared in the doorway, and his eyes were bright with hope, and the youngling lives not yet, Amy cautioned him. But he has a chance now, and a real chance, and keep doing what we have been doing, and keep talking to him, and keep touching him, and keep reminding him that he is loved, and that is what will bring him home. On the fourth day, Silverscale opened his eyes. It happened during the morning ritual. Amy had created, and Liraine was speaking softly and telling stories while she gently massaged the baby dragon scales with the herb oil, and Amy was checking vital signs, and her small hands were sure and confident, and Embereth was humming in a low dragon sound that vibrated in the bones, and something Amy had suggested might comfort the young one end. Then so slowly that Liraine almost missed it, Silverscale. Eyelids moved, Liraine hand froze, and Amitha. Human was already moving and leaning close, and one hand on Silverscale neck where his pulse beat strongest. And hey there, little one, she said softly in welcome. Back Silverscale eyes opened fully and showing irises like liquid silver, and they were confused and unfocused, but they were aware. And he made a small sound and barely more than a whimper and tried to lift his head. Easy, Amy soothed, and supporting his head with surprising strength for someone so small. And do not try to move too fast. And you have been asleep for a while. Liraine felt the pack bond, which had been a fading thread of despair, suddenly surged with life, and Silverscale consciousness brushed against hers in weak but present. And she sent back warmth and welcome, and fierce joy. Liraine, the baby dragon mental voice, was thin as spider silk, and where I am here. Right, Liraine said, and moving to where the young dragon could see her clearly. And I am here, little one, and you are safe. And you are homey, Bruth. Great head lowered until he was nose to nose with the baby dragon, and you have worried us, youngling, and it is good to see your eyes open over. The next hour's Silverscale improvement was dramatic, and it was not a full recovery, Amy warned, and he was weak and confused, and the mental trauma that had nearly killed him would take time to fully heal, but he was present again, and he was fighting. The hardest part is ahead, Amy said as she prepared a food supplement designed for recovering dragons, and he will have nightmares and flashbacks, and the grief will come in waves. And this is not a cure, Commander, and this is just the beginning of healing. I understand, Liraine said, and watching Silverscale manage a few weeks lapse of the supplement with Amy help, but you gave him back his life, and how can we ever repay such a detainee? Smiled and help him heal, and that is payment enough. And she hesitated, then added, and maybe consider this in your medical science is centuries ahead of ours in many ways, but healing is not just science, and maybe there is room for both approaches, and the high-tech and the high-co touched something deep in Lirain's chest, and the elves had become so advanced and so precise and so perfect in their methods that they had perhaps forgotten the simple power of presence and of touch and of ancient wisdom that worked not because it was logical but because it was true. Teach us, Liraine said suddenly, and your methods, and your philosophy, and stay and teach us how to blend what we know with what you know. Nami looked startled, and Commander, I am just one medic with a bag of herbs and my grandmother notebook, and I am not qualified to you. Saved a life, we had said. Was beyond saving, Liraine interrupted, and you did it with techniques our healers dismissed as primitive, and that makes you more than qualified? And she glanced at Embereth, who rumbled agreement, and the Skyborn Guard would be honored to have you as a consultant, and if you are willing, Amy, look down at Silverscale, who had managed to curl into a more comfortable position and was watching her with trusting eyes, and a smile spread across her face. And I would be honored, but their moment of celebration was broken by the wail of alarms. Lorraine combat instincts, which were sharpened over 3 centuries, kicked in immediately, and she was at the chamber entrance in a heartbeat, and her hand on the crystal communication panel, and report the voice that came back was tight with controlled panic. And Commander, we have incoming in Void collective fleet and 3 cruisers and a carrier, and they are heading straight for the medical district. Lorraine. Blood ran cold, and the medical district, and where the wounded were, and where the young were, and where Silver Scale, who had barely recovered, lay vulnerable. They found us. Embereth snarled, and his body tensing for flight, and through their bond Lyran felt his rage building, and they have come to finish what they started. Dami had gone pale, but her voice was steady. And how long do we have? 15 minutes to weapons range, Lorraine said grimly, and she looked at the human medic and at the young dragon who had just opened his eyes, and at the choice that was no choice at all. And Amy, you need to leave and get to your ship. I am not leaving him, Amy said flatly. And if you are fighting, I am staying with Silver Scale. Lorraine wanted to argue and to order and to command, but she recognized that expression, and she had seen it in her own mirror often enough, and the look of someone who had found something worth standing ground for. Then stay in the deep chambers, Lorraine said, and pray to whatever gods your people worship that we can hold them. She turned to Embereth, and through their bond flowed a wordless communication in strategy and tactics and the grim math of desperate battle. We fly, Embereth said simply. We fly, Lyran agreed as she raced toward her armor and her weapons. And as the alarms wailed and the crystal towers began to pulse with the red light of war ready, Lorraine felt something she had not felt since the day she had found Silver Scale and the wreckage. Purpose, the Void Collective had taken too much already. And they would not take this, and they would not take the child she had sworn to protect or the human who had saved him. They would not. Pasami helped move Silver Scale to the deep chamber, and a reinforced room carved far below the surface and designed to withstand orbital bombardment. And the young dragon was confused and frightened. And what is happening? Bad people are coming, Amy said gently as she settled him on soft bedding. And but Lorraine and Embereth are going to stop them, and you need to rest and get strong. Will you stay with me? Silver Scale asked, and his mental voice small and scared. I will stay, Amy promised, and I am not going anywhere. Above them they could hear the sounds of preparation and dragons taking flight and weapons charging and warriors moving to battle stations, and the crystal spires sang with energy as the planetary defenses came on. Lorraine appeared in the doorway and fully armored now, and her weapons gleaming, and she looked every inch the warrior she was in 300 years of battle experience written in her stance. Keep him safe, Lorraine said to Amy. Well, Amy replied. Lorraine nodded, and then she was gone, and racing toward the sky, and toward the battle, and toward the void fleet that had dared to threaten what was hers. The deep chamber. Amy sat beside Silver Scale, and one hand on his scales, and told him stories to keep his mind off the fear, and outside the battle was about to begin. The Void Collective ships were nightmares made real, and organic technology mixed with dark matter reactors, and they moved through space like hunters swimming through deep water, and their holes pulsed with light that seemed to drink in brightness rather than give it out. And the 3 cruisers moved around the carrier and a massive ship that was bigger than even the largest elf. Warships. Lorraine, mounted on Embereth, back in full combat armor, led the Skyborn Guard into the teeth of the enemy. Fletha elf dragons were magnificent in battle, and Embereth red scales seemed to burn as he released streams of plasma hot fire that splashed against void shielding, and around him a dozen other dragons wheeled and struck, and their riders firing precision weapons that punched through armor with surgical accuracy. And the elves held the line against the void for centuries, and they were the guardians of this sector and the shield wall against the darkness. But they were outnumbered, and they were defending wounded left flank. Lorraine called through the come as a void cruiser broke formation and made a run toward the planet's surface, and 2 dragons peeled off to stop it. But the carrier was launching fighters now, and small, deadly shapes that swarmed like insects through her bond with Embereth. Lorraine felt his tiredness, and they had been fighting for nearly an hour, and even great dragon strength had limits, and the void forces were testing them and looking for weaknesses. And waiting for the moment when exhaustion would create an opening, and then something unexpected happened. Void fleet of voice came across all channels and speaking in heavily accented but understandable Galactic Common, and this is Captain Linda Hayes of the Terran Medical Corps' vessel Mercy. Call, and you are attacking a protected medical facility in violation of the sanctuary. Accords and stand down Amelia Lorraine in the middle of a fighting run felt her heart skip, and the human ship and Amy ship, and what were they doing? The Void response was predictable, and a cruiser turned its weapons toward the Mercy call and charging for a killing shot, and the human ship did something impossibly, moved directly toward the Void. "Cruiser Captain Hayes, what are you doing?" Lorraine screamed into the com showing. "Then what humans do when someone threatens our medics," came the calm reply of the Mercy. Call was not designed for combat, and it had basic shields, and maybe a few defensive weapons, and against a Void cruiser it would last seconds, but it did not have to last long though. Human ship path took it directly into the cruiser flight path, and at the last possible moment the Void ship tried to change course in its organic systems. Reacting with hunter instinct to avoid a collision, and the move put it directly in the firing line of 3 elf dragons, they did not waste the chance. "All human vessels, this is Hayes," the captain voice rang out again, and Terran Doctrine Echo 7. 7 is now in effect, and defend the medics, and defend the wounded, and show them why humanity never leaves their healers behind. Then from behind Velshara second moon, they came, not warships and not destroyers or cruisers or any military vessel, and hospital ships and medical transports and even a few converted cargo ships with Red Cross markings hastily painted on their hulls, and 15 human ships, and none of them armed for serious combat. They formed a wall between the Void fleet and the Planetar. The insane Emberath rumbled even as he banked to take advantage of the confusion rippling through the Void formation. No, Lorraine breathed an understanding suddenly, and they are human, the Void collective, for all their terrifying technology and ruthless efficiency operated on certain rules, and that prey would run, and that the weak would hide, and that the rational response to overwhelming force was retreat. Humans apparently had not read that manual. The medical ships did not fire, and they did not attack, and they simply held position and broadcasting on all frequencies about the Sanctuary Accords and about medical neutrality and about the laws of civilized warfare. They turned their shields to maximum and waited on. The Void collective paused. Lorraine had fought the Void for decades, and she knew them, and they were efficient and calculating. And they would sacrifice anything for victory, but they also followed certain rules and ancient protocols that governed warfare among the older species, and the Sanctuary Accords were among the most sacred, and medical facilities were protected, and healers were neutral ground. The humans were forcing the Void to choose and break the ancient laws in front of the entire galactic community, or withdraw. "Skaborn guard," Lorraine said into the com, and her voice carrying the weight of command and the thrill of hope and fighting formation. "Delta and coordinate with the human vessels, and show the Void what happens when they threaten those under our protection." The battle that followed was unlike any Lorraine had fought before, and the human ships, unarmed, as they were, proved surprisingly good at disruption, and they positioned themselves in awkward spots, enforcing Void vessels to waste energy on moving around them, and they broadcast sensor noise that messed up targeting systems, and one clever transport even dumped its emergency water reserves in a Void ship path and creating a debris cloud that scattered their formation. And the elf dragons, no longer fighting alone, found new strength. Then Burwath, working with a human hospital ship called Hope Light, managed to trap a Void fighter group between his fire and the ship-reinforced shields and the fighters. Designed to avoid dragon breath but not rated for sustained impacts, shattered like crystal. "I am beginning to understand," Emberath said through their bond, "why the humans survived first contact with the galaxy, and they are mad, but it is a useful madness." The Void carrier, realizing its tactical advantage was fading, attempted one final push, and it launched every remaining fighter and made a direct burn toward the planet and weapons, charging for a bombardment. Lorraine saw it happening as if in slow motion, and saw the carrier dark matter cannons building power, and saw the path that would take its fire directly into the medical district, and into the chambers where the wounded rested where Silver Scale and Amy wedded no, she whispered no. She roared Demberwath, did not need words, and through their bond intention flowed like lightning, and he folded his wings and dropped into a dive that would have torn apart a lesser dragon and Lorraine. Holding on with the practice of centuries felt, the wind screamed past as they fell like a red meteor. They were not going to make it, and the carrier was too far, and the angle was wrong, and the physics were impossible. And then Amy Carter, voice clear and calm, came across the commander. If you get close enough, I can do something about those cannons. You are in the shelter. Lorraine shouted over the wind. Was in the shelter, came the reply. And turns out, Silverscale heals fast when properly motivated. The baby dragon looked weak in his flight. Unsteady, but his eyes burned with determination that echoed his mother legendary courage, and on his back Amy Carter held what looked like an ordinary medical bag. Silverscale. Can you get me to the carrier bottom side? Amy asked, and her voice steady. Despite the insanity of what she was suggesting, the young dragon response came not in words but in action, and despite his weakness, and despite the death he had so recently escaped, Silverscale found speed, and he wove through the battle space with desperate grace and avoiding fire through luck and courage in equal measure. Amy, what are you planning? Lorraine demanded, even as she and Emberath changed course to provide cover. Your scans showed the carrier cannons use organic parts, right, and living tissue mixed with the weapon's ease. But so they can get sick, it took Lorraine, ancient, brilliant mind, a moment to process what Amy was suggesting. And you want to infect a warship. I want to give it the equivalent of very aggressive food poisoning, Amy corrected. And my grandmother recipe and works on most carbon-based life. And I think the casual addition of I think should have been terrifying, but instead, Lorraine found herself laughing, and a wild sound that rang through the Comemberworth. Get them close and all dragons cover the youngling what followed would be sung. About in the halls of Velshara, for generations Silvers barely recovered, flew with a courage that shamed healthy dragons, and Amy Carter, human medic, clung to his back and threw glass bottles of something that looked like herbal tea mixed with what she cheerfully called bacteria cultures I really should not have in a civilian medical kit. The bottles shattered against the void. Carrier organic armor, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the carrier light flickered and stuttered, and the cannons halfway through their charge cycle spasmed, and organic systems, meeting an aggressive sickness they had no defense against, began to fail in cascades. It is working. Amy's voice was filled with amazed delight, and Grandma Hayes, you were right about bacterial cultures being universal. That carrier, with its weapons offline and its systems in chaos, broke off the attack, and the remaining void ships, seeing their main ship crippled by what appeared to be biological warfare, made the logical choice. They retreated. The Skyborn Guard dragons and humans together watched the void fleet disappear into FTL and leaving the skies of Velshara clear for a moment. There was only silence then. The cheering began 3 weeks later. Lorraine stood in the great hall of Velshara, watching Silverscale play with a group of other young dragons, and he still had nightmares. Amy had warned and still had moments when the grief would hit him, but he was healing and growing stronger every day. The young dragon saw her watching and bounded over, and his silver scales now bright with health and Lorraine. And Amy says, I can start flight training next week. You keep up with your therapy sessions, Amy added, walking up beside the baby dragon, and she had been given rooms in the medical complex and had been working with the elf healers and sharing techniques and learning their advanced methods while teaching them her grandmother wisdom therapy sessions. Lorraine raised an eyebrow, talking about feeling, Silverscale said with the long-suffering tone of a youngling subjected to adult nonsense, but Amy says it is important, and she gives me the good snacks after he bounded off to rejoin his friends. And Amy smiled in positive reinforcement, and works on every species I have met. Lorraine watched the young dragons play, and feeling something settle in her chest that she had not felt in years, and peace, perhaps, or hope. The council has made a decision, she said quietly, and they want to establish a joint program in elf medical science combined with human healing arts, and they are calling it the Sanctuary Initiative. MUI's widened, and that is incredible, but why tell me? Because they want you to help lead it. And Lorraine turned to face the human fully and you saved one life with old remedies and stubborn courage, and imagine what we could do together, and your people gift for presence and for caring and for seeing. Healing is more than just fixing what is broken, and our people advanced technology and centuries of knowledge, and together we could change how the galaxy thinks about medicine. Amy was quiet for a long moment, and turning the leather book in her hands, and my grandmother used to say that healing was about building bridges, and between body and mind, and between patient and healer, and between knowledge and wisdom. And she looked up, and her smile was brilliant, and I think she would like the idea of building bridges between species. 'Twas that a yes, Emberworth, who had been coiled nearby in what he claimed was a nap, but was obviously listening, raised his great head, and the human stays, and good and she makes. The medical chambers smell better, and she has that device that plays the pleasing sound patterns you like classical music. Amy asked, surprised eye like Mozart. Emberoth corrected with dignity, and the others are merely acceptably. Rain felt laughter bubbling up in her chest, and genuine and free, and when had she last laughed like Thissa chime sounded. And Captain Linda Hayes appeared on the communication crystal, and her image projected in glowing blue. And Amy, we are scheduled to leave for the Antares sector tomorrow in medical relief mission. And you still planning to come home, or are you going native? On Usami glanced at Lorraine and at Silver Scale playing with his packmates, and at the crystal towers of Velshara rising into the purple sky. And actually, Captain, I think I am exactly where I need to be, but send my love to the crew. And tell them the next time they want to stare down a void carrier, maybe bring actual weapons. Hayes laughed. And where's the fun in that? And fair winds, Lieutenant, and you have earned this. Communication ended, and Amy looked at Lorraine with an expression the elf was learning to recognize, and determination mixed with hope, and just a little bit of that mad human courage that had faced down a battle fleet armed with nothing but medical ethics and boldness. So Amy said, when do we start? Immediately. Lorraine replied, then there is a conference next week, and every major species will be represented, and they want to hear about what happened here, and about how a dying dragon was saved by ancient remedies, and how a medical ship helped turn a battle. No pressure. Then you face down the Void Collective with herbal tea and bacteria cultures, and I think you can handle a conference. Amy laughed, and the sound echoed through the hall, and bright and human and impossibly alive. And you know what? And you are right, and let us show them what humans and elves can do when we work together. As they walked toward the medical complex and discussing plans and possibilities, Lorraine felt Embereth presence in her mind, and warm with satisfaction. The small human grows on one, the dragon observed, and like a particularly stubborn moss she saved Silver Scale life, Lorraine reminded him. And in doing so, perhaps she has saved something else as well. And we had forgotten, I think, that healing is not just science, and it is also hope, and it is also love, and the humans remember this even when we have forgotten. Lorraine watched Amy kneeled to examine a young dragon injured wing, and her movements gentle and her voice soothing, and the baby dragon who had been whimpering quieted under her touch. Yes, Lorraine agreed softly, and they remembered that night as the 3 moons of Velshara rose over the crystal towers. Irene stood on her balcony and looked up at the stars, and out there the Void Collective still lurked, and out there dangers and battles and losses waited, but also out there humanity had exploded into the galaxy with their mad courage and their old remedies and their absolute refusal to abandon those in their care. And now the elves would stand beside them, and not as teachers or students, but as allies and as friends, as healers who understood that sometimes the best medicine was simply refusing to give. Up in the medical chambers below, Silver Scale slept peacefully in his nightmares, held at bay by the presence of his pack and the lingering scent of chamomile and lavender, and in her rooms Amy Carter made notes in her grandmother notebook, and adding new recipes and new techniques in building bridges between ancient wisdom and advanced science. And on the balcony, Liren, Stormweaver, pack leader of the Skyborn Guard, bonded companion to the great dragon. Embereth smiled and thought of tomorrows. They would be good tomorrows, and hard, yes, and challenging certainly, but